안녕하세요. 오늘도 이거를 해보겠습니다. 29쪽부터 해볼게요. Listening to the air. Communicating across cultures. When I arrived at my hotel in New Delhi, I was hot and, more important, hungry. Although I spent that week conducting classes for a group of Indian executives at the Swamp five-star Oberoi Hotel, the Indian business school hosting me put me up in a more modest and much smaller residence several miles away. Though quiet and clean, it looked like a big concrete box with windows set back from the road and around it surrounded by a wall with the locked gate. This will be fine, I thought as I dropped my bag off in my room. Staying in a simple hotel just steps from the bustle of workaday New Delhi will make it that much easier for me to get the flavor of the city. Lunch was at the top of my agenda. The very friendly young man behind the concierge desk jumped to attention when he saw me approaching. I asked about the good place to eat. There is a good restaurant just to the left of the hotel. I recommend it highly, he told me. It's called Swagat. You can't miss it. It sounded perfect. I walked out to the road and looked to the left. The street was whirlwind of colors, smells, activities. I saw a grocery store, a cloth vendor, a family of five all piled onto one motor scooter, and a bunch of brown spankled chickens pecking in the dust next to the sidewalk. No restaurant. You didn't find it? The kind concierge asked in a puzzled tone as I re-entered the hotel. This time, the young man explained, just walk out of the hotel, cross the street, and the restaurant will be on your left. It's next to the market. There is a sign. You can't miss it, he said again. Well, apparently I could. I tried to do exactly as instructed, crossing the street immediately in front of the hotel and again looking to the left. As I saw no sign of the restaurant, I turned to the left and walked a while. It was a little confusing, as the street was jam-packed. After a minute or so, I came to a small side street full of people, food stalls, a woman selling sandals and saris. Was this the market the concierge mentioned? But after careful examinations of what I felt to be all possible interpretations of on your left, I began to wonder if I was being filmed as a stunt for some types of reality TV show. I headed back to the hotel. The concierge smiled kindly at me again, but I could tell he was thinking I really wasn't very small. Scratching his head in bewilderment at my inability to find the obvious, he announced, I will take you there. So we left the hotel, crossed the street, turned to the left, and then walked for nearly 10 minutes, waving our way through traffic on the bustling sidewalk and passing several side streets and countless heads of cattle on the way. At last, just beyond a large bank, perched quietly over a fruit store on the second floor of a yellow stucco building, I spotted the small sign of the red Swagat. As I thanked the concierge for extreme kindness, I couldn't help wondering why he hadn't told me. Cross the street, turn left, walk 9 minutes, look for the bank on the corner, and when you see the big drugstore, look up the second floor of the yellow stucco building for a sign with the restaurant's name. And as this question floated through my mind, I could tell that the kindly concierge was wondering, how will this poor dim-witted woman possibly make it through the week? As my search for lunch in New Delhi suggests, the skills involved in being an effective communicator vary dramatically from one culture to another. In the United States and other Anglo-Saxon cultures, people are trained, mostly subconsciously, to communicate as literally and explicitly as possible. Good communication is all about clarity and explicitness, and accountability for accurate transmissions of the message is placed firmly on the communicator. If you don't understand, it's my fault. My fault. If you don't understand, it's my fault. By contrast, in many Asian cultures, including China, India, Japan, Indonesia, messages are more often conveyed implicitly, requiring the listener to read between the lines. Good communication is subtitled, layered, and may depend on copious subtext, with responsibility for the transmissions of the message shared between the one sending the message and the one receiving it. The same applies to many African cultures, including those found in Kenya and Zimbabwe, and to a less degree Latin American cultures such as Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Latin European cultures such as Spain, Italy, Portugal, including France. The fact is that the hotel concierge provided all of the information necessary for someone from his own culture to find the swagat. An Indian living in the same Delhi cultural context would likely have figured out quickly where the restaurant was the clues provided. She would have been eating her lunch while I was still wandering wearily around the streets. My quest for the Swagat restaurant illustrates that being a good listener is just as important for effective communications as being a good speaker. And both of these essential skills are equally variable from one culture to another. It was springtime in France, where I had been living several years, when I was asked to give a presentation at the Human Resource Conference in Paris, sponsored by Owens Corning, a leader, a leading global producer of the residential building materials. Owens Corning is headquartered in Toronto, Ohio, a good 11-hour drive from my home state of Minnesota, but still within the tribal boundaries of my native Midwestern American culture. When I arrived at the conference, I found 50 human resource directors assembled in a typical Parisian hotel space with the high ceilings and sunshine streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. 38 of the participants were from Toledo, and the rest were from Europe and Asia, but all had been working for Owens Corning for at least a decade. I took a seat in the back corner of the room just as the presentation preceding mine was beginning. The speaker would be the David Brown, the company's CEO, relaxed and unimposing, wearing a blazer but no tie. David strolled into the room and wearing a warm smile greeted several of the attendees by their first name. But from the hush that descended when he stepped to the podium, it was obvious that this group of HR directors considered him a celebrity. Brown spent 60 intense minutes describing his vision of the company's future. He spoke in the simple words, repeating the key points, and reinforcing his messages with the bullet points slides. The group listened carefully, asked a few respectful questions, and gave Brown an appreciated round of applause before he departed. Now it was my turn. My job was to talk about the subject I know best, cross-cultural management. I worked with the group for an hour, explaining in detail the communicating skill and its value as the tool for understanding how various cultures convey messages. As if to reinforce my theme, Kenji Takaki, a Japanese HR executive who had lived for 2 years in Toledo, raised his hand and offered these observations. In Japan, we implicitly learn as we're growing up to communicate between the lines and to listen between the lines when others are speaking. Communicating messages without saying them directly is a deep part of our culture, so deep that we do it without even realizing it. To give an example, every year in Japan, there is a vote for the most popular new words. A few years ago, the words of the year was KY. It stands for Kunki Yamenai, which means one who cannot read the air. In other words, the person sorely lacking the ability to read between the lines. In Japan, if you can't read the air, you're not a good listener. At this point, one of the Americans broke in. What do you mean, read the air? Takaki explained. If I am in the meeting in Japan and one person is implicitly communicating disagreements or discomfort, we should be able to read the atmosphere to pick up on that discomfort. If someone else doesn't pick up the messages, we say he is KY guy. The American chuckled. I guess that means we Americans are all KY guys. Takaki offered no comment, which I read as an indication that he agreed. Then Takaki continued. When Mr. Brown was giving his presentations, I was working hard to listen with all of my senses to make sure I was picking up all the messages that he was trying to pass. But now, as I'm listening to Erin, I'm asking myself, is it possible that there was no meaning beyond Mr. Brown's very simple words? And with all of you in this very room, whom I have worked with for so many years, and when I read the air during our discussions, am I picking up messages we have not intended to pass? This was a very astute question and a very disturbing one. The group fell silent, with a few jaws hanging slightly agape as Takaki quietly read the air. With order, the fireworks for them. The contracting styles of the communication represented by the managers from the Toledo and their colleague from Japan are often referred to as low context and high context respectively. In order to understand some of the implications, suppose you're having a discussion with Sally, a business colleague, and you both come from a culture that prefers low context communication. People from some cultures are conditioned from childhood to assume a low level of shared context, that is, few shared reference points and comparatively little implicit knowledge linking speakers and listener. Under these circumstances, it's highly likely that while speaking with Sally, you will implicitly spell out your ideas, providing all the background knowledge and details necessary to understand your message. In low context culture, effective communication must be simple, clear, and explicit in order to effectively pass the messages, and most communicators will obey this requirement, usually without being fully conscious of it. The United States is the lowest context culture in the world, followed by the Canada and Australia and the Netherlands and Germany and the United Kingdom. Through cultural norms are transmitted from one generation to the next through means that are generally indirect and subliminal, you may remember receiving some deliberate lessons concerning appropriate ways to communicate. I certainly received such lessons as a child growing up in the United States. My third grade teacher, Mary Jane, a tall, thin woman with tidy curly hair, used to coach us during our Monday mornings circle meetings using the motto, say what you mean and mean what you said. When I was 16, I took an elective class at Minneapolis South High School on giving effective presentations. This is where I learned the traditional American rules for successfully transferring a powerful message to an audience. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've told them. This is the philosophy of low context communications in a nutshell. I received lessons in a low context communication at home, too. Like many siblings, my older brother and I argued constantly. In an effort to reduce our squabbling, Mom used to coach us in active listening. You speak to me as clearly and explicitly as possible. Then I'll repeat what I understood you to say as clearly and explicitly as I can. The technique is designed to help people quickly identify and correct misunderstandings, thereby reducing, if not eliminating, one common cause of needless, pointless debate. Childhood lessons like these imbued me with the assumption that being explicit is simple good communications. But as Takaki explained, good communication is in a high context culture like Japan is very different. In Japan, as in India, China, and many other countries, people learned a very different style of communications as children. One that depends on unconscious assumptions about common reference points and shared knowledge. For example, let's say that you and a business colleague named Mariam both come from a high context culture like Iran. Imagine that Mariam has traveled to your home for a visit and arrived via a late evening train at 10 p.m. If you ask Mariam whether she would like to eat something before going to bed, when Mariam responds with a polite "No, thank you," your response will be to ask her 2 more times. Only if she responds "No, thank you" 3 times will you accept "no" as a real answer. The explanation lies in the shared assumptions that every polite Iranian understands. Both you and Marianne know that the well-mannered person will not accept food the first time it is offered, no matter how hungry she may be. Thus, if you don't ask her a second time or a third time, Maria may go to bed suffering from hunger pains, while you feel sorry that she hasn't tasted the chicken salad you'd prepared especially for her. In a high context culture like Iran's, it's not necessary indeed. It's often inappropriate to spell out certain messages too explicitly. If Marian replied to your first offer of food, "Yes, please, serve me a big portion of whatever you have, because I am dying of hunger. This response would be considered inelegant and perhaps quite rude. Fortunately, shared assumptions learned from a childhood makes such bluntness unnecessary. You and Marianne both know that "no thank you" likely means "please ask me again because I am famished." Remember my confusing encounter with the concierge in New Delhi? If I had been an Indian from Delhi with a shared cultural understanding of how to interpret implicit messages, I would have been better able to interpret the concierge's directions. Lacking those assumptions left me bewildered and unable to find my way to the restaurant. The interplay of language and history. Languages reflect the communication styles of the cultures that use those languages. For example, Japanese and Hindi as spoken in New Delhi are both high context languages in which a relatively high percentage of words can be interpreted multiple ways based on how and when they are used. In Japanese, for instance, the word ash means both leg and foot, depending on context. Japanese also possesses the countless homonyms, of which there are only a few in English. Dear and dear, for example. In a Hindi, the word kal means both tomorrow and yesterday. You have to hear the whole sentences to understand in which context it has been used. For this reason, when speaking Japanese or Hindi, you really do have to read the air to understand the message. I work in English and also in French, a much higher context language than English. For one thing, there are 7 times more words in English than in French. 500,000 versus 70,000, which suggests that French relies on contextual clues to resolve semantic ambiguities to a greater extent than English. Many words in French have multiple possible meanings. For example, ennuyé can either bored or bordered, depending on the context in which it's used, which means that the listener responsible for the discerning the intentions of the speaker. The French language contains the number of the idioms and specifically refer to high context communications. One is the sous-entendu, literally means under the heart. To use sous-entendu basically means to say something without saying it. For example, if a man says to his wife, "There are a lot of calories in that toffee ice cream you bought," he sous-entendu maybe, "You have gained some weight, so don't eat this ice cream." He has not implicitly said that she is getting fat, but when he sees her reach down to throw a shoe at him, he will know that she picked up his sous-entendu. I I once asked a French client who has complaining about incompetent team leader whether he has described the problem to his boss. The client responded, "Well, yes, but it was sous-entendu. I made it known so that he could see it if he wanted to see it." The same expressions exist in Spanish, sobreentendido, and Portuguese, subentendido, and although less common, they are used in much the same way. A similar French expression refers to saying something at the deuxième degré, literally the second degree. I may say one thing explicitly, my first degree messages, but the statements may have an unspoken subtext, which is the second degree meaning. The use of second degree messages is a feature of French literature. Consider the 17th century writer Jean de La Fontaine. At the first degree, he wrote a simple children's tale, but if you understand the contemporary context within which the stories were written, you may pick up his second degree of meaning, a political messages for adults. For example, La Fontaine's famous favor of the grasshopper and the ant conveys the straightforward moral that the most children understand. It's important to economize to prepare for the difficult times, but only sophisticated adult readers of his own day recognized the La Fontaine's second degree meanings. second-degree messages that King Louis should stop spending so much money on rerouting the Euro River to supply water to Versailles fountains. In French, a good business communicator will use second-degree communications in everyday life. While giving a presentation, a manager may say one thing that has an implicit meaning everyone understands. But those who have some shared context may also receive second-degree messages. That is the real intended meaning. English, then, is a lower context language that the Romance languages descended from Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, while the Romance languages are lower context than most Asian languages. However, a look at the communicating skills and its ranking of cultures from the most explicit to most implicit shows that language is not the whole story. See figure 1.1. The United States is the lowest context culture in the world, and all Anglo-Saxon cultures fall down on the left-hand side of the scale, with the United Kingdom as the highest context culture of the Anglo-Saxon cluster. All the countries that speak Romance languages, including European countries like Italy, Spain, and France, and Latin American cultures like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, fall to the middle right of the scale. Brazil is the lowest context culture in this cluster. Many African and Asian countries fall even further right. Japan has the distinct of being the highest context culture in the world, and Korea is also. And as you can see, that language only gives a partial indicator as to where a culture will fall on the communicating skills. The gap between the United States and the United Kingdom, both Anglo-Saxon countries, is quite large. Is the gap between the Brazil and Peru, both Romance language countries. 40쪽까지 오늘은 11쪽을 읽었습니다. 안녕.